Back in 2016, author Han Gang's The Vegetarian became the first Korean novel to win the Man Booker International Prize. Since then, a number of Korean works have been nominated for this British award, with Chung Bora's Cursed Bunny making the shortlist last year. So who are the talented translators taking Korean literary works beyond borders? And what is behind the growing global popularity of Korean literature in recent years? Also, how are challenges in the art of translating Korean into English being addressed? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today, we explore the art of translating Korean literature into English amid a growing appetite for Korean works in the international market. For more, I have Anton Hur, the translator, who was double longlisted and shortlisted for the 2022 International Booker Prize. Anton, it's a pleasure.
Thank you for having me.
I also have Professor Kevin Smith at the University of California Berkeley joining our session virtually as well. Professor Smith, it's good to have you with us.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Professor, let's start with you then. Let's begin with some tangible verification, Professor Smith, about the actual popularity of Korean literature overseas in recent years.
Certainly. Well, the 2010s saw two major literary events, the first being the unprecedented 2012 success of Kyung-Suk Shin's novel, Please Look After Mom, which won the Man Asian Literary Prize, sold millions of copies, and even attracted endorsements from Oprah and Amazon. Second, many will be familiar with Han Gang's 2007 novel, The Vegetarian, first published in 2015 in English, becoming an instant bestseller, winning the Man Booker Prize, and swiftly cementing its up-and-coming author's reputation. Since those two monumental events, translations of a wide range of modern and contemporary Korean works have continued to appear, both from major publishers like HarperCollins and Vintage, as well as independent presses such as the LA-based Kaya Publishers with its new Magpie series and the UK's Honford Star. The recent work is diverse in genre. It ranges from a young adult fiction and family drama to science fiction and fantasy, and even niche markets such as queer poetry have turned their attention to Korea recently with the groundbreaking publication of Kim Hyun's poetry collection, Glory Hole, for example. Two especially noteworthy instances from the last 2 years are the mainstream success of science fiction luminary Bo Young Kim, with two collections of hers being published in 2021, and the recent sensation of Bora Chung's Cursed Bunny, beautifully translated by my talented co-panelist Anton Hur. I should note quickly that with the exception of Kyung-Suk Shin, most of the authors I've mentioned have only debuted in South Korea in the 2000s, so we're witnessing a progressively shorter grace period between the publication dates of the original Korean texts and their English translations.
Right. And against that backdrop, Anton, as Professor Smith has said, as a talented translator yourself, would you say the demand for English translations of Korean literature has indeed been growing in recent years? And if so, how do you explain this demand?
Yes, thank you for the shout out for Cursed Bunny, Professor Smith. I actually have to disagree on the content of this question because on the ground, as a practicing literary translator, there is no higher demand for Korean literary works in English translation. There's more attention being paid to the very few books that are being published in the form of literary prizes and nominations and reviews. But this is because of the excellent quality of contemporary Korean literature, but also because the quality of Korean translators is going up in recent years. And however, the number of Korean books being published in English remains more or less stagnant and almost completely negligible. Maybe 10 Korean translations a year are being published in the US and the UK on a good year. And that number isn't going to increase by any significant means this year, it looks like. So frankly, we need to fund more translations.
Right. And before we get into details on that then, Professor Smith, in the meantime then, what do you believe is fueling the global interest, if I may, in Korean literature?
Well, I would point to three interrelated factors which contribute to a relative upsurge, although I do agree with Anton that it's still not to the levels that we would hope for. But first would be the nature of the globalized world in which contemporary authors are living. Second would be the great generic diversity of the literature being produced. And the third would be the growth in the number of active and talented translators, as Anton mentioned. So first, much of the writing that's being translated now hails from a younger, more diverse generation of South Koreans Koreans who are grappling with many of the same pressing global issues that affect readerships in the Anglophone world. Given the radical interconnectedness of our present through televisual media and the internet and strengthened ties between South Korea and the US, everyday life for urban middle-class Korean writers is not as distant from their Anglophone readers and vice versa. And I think that this relatability contributes a great deal to the current appeal of Korean literary works in foreign settings. Second, we must remember that for much of the 20th century, the Korean literary field was dominated by a form of social realism that dealt with the nation's uneven development and catastrophic wartime legacy, rendering past literary work somewhat foreign to the concerns facing Anglophone readers, however superficial that perspective may be. But with the hyperdevelopment of South Korea and its democratization over the past 30 years, globalized nations are approaching something of a social convergence that renders Korean literature more intelligible internationally.
Right. And expanding on what Professor Smith has just said, Anton, there are indeed pundits who claim that this popularity at the moment is in part being driven by perhaps a shift in tone adopted by younger Korean novelists who choose to touch upon concerns as well as issues that are relatively universal, but that also include personal twists. What do you say?
I agree 100% with everything Professor Smith just mentioned. That's exactly the shift in landscape that I'm also seeing in terms of genre diversity and so on. I think for me personally, it's very important to translate edgier, newer Korean literature by women and non-men, queer literature, science fiction, and so on, genre works. This literature has always existed in Korea, but Korea's literary institutions, like LTI Korea, have always marginalized them. Years ago, I wanted to translate a graphic novel, for instance, and Korea's largest literary translation funder rejected my funding application because graphic novels aren't real literature. So Cursed Bunny by Bora Chung, notably, was given the lowest amount of literary translation grant that you can give to a literary translation at the time. And it went on to win the Penheim, that's a very prestigious grant given by PEN America, and it also, of course, became shortlisted for the International Booker Prize. So it proved its literary worth overseas when it was overlooked in Korea. We need to stop empowering the literary establishment, like certain academics and government bureaucrats. They need to stop making the choices in what gets translated and what's read. And they need to start listening to literary translators who answer only to actual world Anglophone readership. Translator-centric translation support is crucial for us to continue to build momentum in the extremely important market that is world Anglophone.
I see. And Anton, this is an impromptu question. Is that perhaps what the purpose of your Smoking Tigers is about then? This group of translators that you also manage or work with to translate Korean work that perhaps is marginalized?
Absolutely. That's one of the thrusts of Smoking Tigers. Mostly we came together as a translation group when we realized that no one was helping us. No one was helping us understand what the Anglophone market, how the market worked. There were a lot of people teaching translation, but they were teaching it in a very academic, very kind of, as an aesthetic exercise and not really as an exercise that can actually make money and, sell books. And so for us, it was very, very important to kind of pool our resources, come together and address this huge hole in our education and try to understand the market and try to sell actual Korean books in the actual book market. And that's how Smoking Tigers came to be.
Right, I see. Meanwhile, Professor Smith, on the topic of translation now, there are surely some Korean words that do not have English translations that do them justice, which is why the Oxford English Dictionary now has some 26 Korean words. That being said, Professor Smith, what are your translation suggestions for certain Korean words, including words like 애교 and 정, which, in my opinion, are some of the toughest to translate?
Well, the influential theorist of translation Walter Benjamin suggested once that while two words in two respective languages may contrast in their form of expression, what he calls intention, their object of reference may coincide. So a term like 애교 and charm in English may be distinct utterances, but speakers of both modern Korean and modern English can mutually understand their analogy. Everybody knows what it means to feel grief, and everybody has heart, 정, and that is to say, each of us understands that painful experiences in life are cumulative and often shared collectively, or that some individuals are more susceptible to temperamental whims and harbor greater emotional depths than others. This is not to say that discrete terms are easily translatable or identical, but that translation constitutes a process of locating in the target language an equivalent or parallel experience that may have the same effect on the reader as the original terms had on their own. No two languages have exact counterparts, I think, but the very fact that unique individuals can understand each other in the same language, which is to say, or not to mention that it's possible for someone to learn a foreign language at all. This suggests that language is a social and collective phenomenon and no one individual's private property. To speak or to use language is already a socially symbolic act. When it comes to certain Korean terms, I personally find that the most difficult ones are those pertaining to color. So for example, Koreans conflate blue and green, often chung, and minor gradations in shade. You have dark blue versus light blue, paran and puran, which can also refer to green or sometimes even purple mountains. I find that these color terms are difficult to visualize linguistically.
Right. And Anton, staying with the same question, do you care to share a few of your suggestions very briefly?
If you want to know how I solve these problems, you have to buy my books and read them.
Okay, that's a good point.
I'm not giving away my intellectual property on the TV, sorry. But we do have great solutions to these problems, and they're great solutions. They're really, really great solutions. I will say this, though. Nothing is untranslatable. If literary translation is impossible, literature itself is impossible because literature itself is a translation of the world into words.
Right. Okay. Good response right there. Anton, now this is something my colleagues and I here at Arirang also face as well. There are some Korean statements made by policymakers here, government officials, that can be beautifully brief and yet contain comprehensive content. But when we translate them into English to offer them to our broader audience, of course, our global audience, they become very long, boring and verbose. How do you deal with this particular dilemma?
This is a very, very interesting dilemma, and it's very real. I completely sympathize with your colleagues. For example, Twitter used to allow 140 characters, but then it increased to 280 characters. But there are 3 languages in the world where they did not increase their word limit to their character limit to 280, and that's Chinese, Japanese, and Korean, because these 3 languages are already so compact, apparently, relative to other languages, that expanding them to 280 characters would kind of defeat the purpose of Twitter for the Korean language. So part of literary translation, a huge part of literary translation, is not just unpacking the Korean into English, but also repacking that English into a more compact English. And this is where your artistry as a translator comes in. And I don't know, it takes a lot of practice and a lot of thinking and a lot of, a lot of worrying over language for you to kind of like reach a certain level where you can repack, where you have the confidence to leave certain things behind and take only what you really need and express it into English, which, is also a very beautiful language and a very poetic language and has a very long and rich tradition. And I believe that those traditions, like once they're respected, which a lot of Korean translators don't respect, I believe that once those traditions are respected, then you will come up with a very beautiful and compact translation.
Right, hopefully. Now, Anton, this next question is something you've probably been asked quite a number of times, but I didn't get to ask you this when we last met last year, that is. And that being said, do you think translation, Anton, is all about accuracy and faithfulness to the given text, or does it include something more?
I've always considered this problem, this dilemma, to be a false binary. You don't have to choose between aesthetics and accuracy. I think accuracy in itself is very beautiful. Often a translator creates their ugliest translations when they're being creative, when they're moving things around, or where they think, oh, I think it was better expressed this way than this way. Whenever I have a problem in the middle of translation, I always go back to the original text and I look at it, and the solution is always, always, always there. So in practice, the best solutions are the most beautiful, and the most beautiful solutions are the most accurate.
Okay, that sounds encouraging. Professor Smith, some critics out there insist that in the process of translation, some information, of course, is bound to be lost. What are your thoughts on this? And is there a way to prevent it or better address this potential loss?
Well, certainly scholars and critics point to something like untranslatability or incommensurability of different cultural idioms, and liken the process of translation to flattening or erasure of indigenous specificity. I think there's much truth in that claim. There is something lost, but I also feel that translation can be much simpler and more universal in spirit. I would borrow my colleague's Jenny Wang Medina's evocative phrase, found in translation. As Anton said earlier, if translation is impossible, then literature itself would be impossible. And we can think of the example of a reader of the same poem bringing different experiences to bear on their interpretation, even when they're operating in the same language. There are losses accompanying discrepancies between different individual worldviews, but there's also something gained from the cooperative negotiation of distinct standpoints. And this is why in the classroom we use the method of discussion as a tried and true way of getting something out of the text. As a teacher, of course, I encourage students to learn Korean and begin to appreciate the original texts, but I think there's a lot of value in making available bodies of knowledge and translation for those who can't afford to learn additional languages. I have some comments about what makes for a skilled translation, but I think maybe we can hold off on that. And I think Anton is much more of a valid, credible source on that than I.
Right, and before I ask you about that, though, Anton, I have another question, and I ask as a layperson. I would assume that if I were to translate a work of literature by an author, I would spend quite a bit of time with that person asking him or her about his or her work. Now, this is something that also happens to us when we attend briefings, press briefings, of course, by ministries, where we have the spokesperson saying one thing, one sentence only, and then we have 2-3 questions to ask about the particular sentence. That being said, I remember in one interview, Anton, you claimed, for me, the norm is not to really know my authors. Could you explain that for us?
Well, first of all, Sunny, you are not a lay person, because if you're a lay person, then the rest of us have to go jump in the lake.
Thank you for your kind words.
The reason why I think that it's not really necessary for me to talk to my authors when I'm translating their works is because I have such confidence in my reading. As a reader, before I'm a translator, I consider myself as a very good reader. I'm a fine translator, but I think I'm a really, really great reader. I'm very highly trained as a reader. So I feel like I understand exactly what my authors are saying in this given moment in time. And I've had many of my authors say, oh, wow, Anton, you understand my text better than I do. So I feel like that's why I never really feel the need to ask my authors about their work, because their work is so great that, it's already there very, very clearly. And I feel like if I were an author and my translator kept asking me about my work, I'd be like, do you not understand what my work is about? Like, are you a bad reader, or am I a bad writer? So I would feel a bit insulted. I don't know. I'm sure no author has ever been uncooperative when I do have questions to ask them. But I feel like if you believe in a work so much that you want to invest a huge chunk of your life translating it, then you probably have a very, very good grasp of it already, and you probably have a very excellent reading of it already. And that's my philosophy. A lot of other translators, they talk to their authors all the time about, and have questions all the time about their work, and that's fine. But my style is to have complete, absolute confidence in my reading so that the translation is completely coherent when it comes out.
Right, I see. Good to know, good to know. Professor Smith, how important is the role of translators, perhaps, to ensuring a greater presence of Korean literature in the global market, would you say?
Well, it's crucial. And we do know, South Korea is already far ahead of other nations in promoting or providing institutional support. But I agree with Anton that there have been certain limits and constraints to that in the past. I think it's crucial for us to afford greater autonomy and participatory control to the translators, whether it be selecting works, negotiating financial remuneration, finding publishers. I think this should be relegated to local publicly funded institutions, which allow a certain democratic involvement in the decision-making by the translators themselves, given that unpredictable whims in the market and rapidly evolving consumer taste leave translators in a somewhat unsustainable and precarious situation. I think academic institutions also have something to add to the role of translation. There is a relative devaluation of translation as a practice relative to other modes of scholarly inquiry. And to redress this, I think we must provide more incentives for scholars to translate literary works as well, whether it be elevating translation status when it comes to faculty publication records or departmental accreditation, or increasing the presence and visibility of practice through dedicated fora, workshops, and even degree programs focusing on translation specifically. And that would allow scholars who are already trained as close readers to produce more literary works and increase the diversity of what's available.
Right. Anton, essentially the task of sharing works of, well, Korean authors, that is, beyond national borders would be to have the presence of equally gifted translators like yourself, as we mentioned earlier. And that being said, as you touched upon earlier on in this session, what can be done, Anton, to better support related efforts?
Money.
Funding.
Funding is the biggest thing that we need. Everything that Professor Smith mentioned is absolutely crucial. I think that not only should there be increased funding for professors, I think professors, especially I think there should be increased funding for Korean studies and Korean literature professors to do research, and also for teaching, because I think academia has a crucial role in bringing up the best readers of Korean literature, because only by having the best readers can we have the best translators. I think it's really, really important that translators, working literary translators, teach translation. I think that's a point that's often neglected, especially in Korea, where they tend to hire professors who have never published a translation to teach literary translation, and they don't have the kind of understanding of the market that we do. They're not as crass as we are, I guess. So I think it's really, really important to fund translation education as taught by translators. But at the end of the day, it's all about funding. I did another interview recently where they said, aside from funding, like, what can we do to increase the regard of literary translators in Korean society? And I said, no, it's not that increasing regard leads to more money. More money leads to the increase in regard. So everything comes from funding. Everything stems from, and that's the reality of capitalist world space. You have to realize that literary translation for me is not an academic exercise. It's not an aesthetic exercise. This is a way that I make my living, and this is the way that translators like me, how we stay in the game. And if you don't stay in the game, then all of our knowledge, all of our networking, all of our institutional knowledge, it's all gone. So we need more support for literary translators and for literary translation.
Right, so definitely we need some more financial support in that field. We have about a minute left, Anton. If there was a book that you would like to recommend to an English language reader who is seeking to indulge in Korean literature for the first time, what one book would you recommend and why? 30 seconds.
Oh, Bora Chung's Curse Buddy.
Thank you so much. And Professor Smith, you as well, one book that you would like to recommend?
I really like I'm Waiting for You by Kim Bo-young, so that would probably be my first choice at present.
Why?
Well, I think that the scale, the cosmic scale of it, and the kind of the temporal difference between the speaker and the addressee is really quite fascinating. It really pushes against kind of the spatial and the temporal limits and the context and setting of much previous Korean literature. It's really pushing the boundaries forward in an exciting new direction.
I see. All right, Professor Smith, thank you so much for your time and your thoughts today. And Anton, as always, it's been a pleasure speaking to you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Right, well, on that note,
again.
Thank you, Professor Smith. On that note, we end this week's editions of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. Have a good weekend. We'll see you next Monday.